Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I'm Courtney Anderson. This is episode 211, episode 211 of this program. And this is a program today that is part of our Communications Communique series. This is a series about communications. And so what we're going to do is share some of the wonderful things that you community members ask me about. One of the areas that I have surprisingly stumbled into in my work is the area of communications. I didn't really study communications. I never took as a young student or a student in my undergraduate study a communications class. I've never taken public speaking classes or debate or anything like that, which probably would have helped me immensely. But as time went on in my life, I learned that a lot of the things I really enjoy doing professionally have pretty substantial communication aspects to them. So I love practicing law in a courtroom, the speaking in court part, which is what most TV shows and movies show. Now, in real life, for most lawyers, they either never do that or they do it very rarely because very few cases actually go to court or litigated. A lot of what lawyers do is paperwork and thinking, neither of which would probably be the most exciting television show to watch, watching someone sit and think and read and write. But that's really what the majority of it is. But I like the performing part, and I love being a professor, and I love performing in a classroom and being able to act out physically and give a lecture on torts or contract law or anything. And then as time went by, I learned that I enjoyed being a public speaker. Didn't even know that wasn't a profession at all. I've shared the story in some programs. I did a multiple part program that I encourage you to check out about how to be a professional speaker, or that professional speaking even exists. Where I talk about how I found that career just sort of looking on the internet one night at my office, thinking maybe there's something else I could do that would be adventurous and exciting in addition to practicing law and being a professor. And then that stumbled into requests and opportunities for me to appear on television and on live television and on national and international television. And that has also resulted in other opportunities to perform in different types of entertainment shows. And so all of this has oddly resulted in communications, which is not something, again, that I have any formal background or expertise in, being a really important part of my career. And so this series is coming at our subjects from that perspective of someone who's I've learned by trial and error, and a lot of errors in terms of communication. And the odd thing is, I in light of all of the experiences I've had to this date, I would really encourage that curriculum for young people, for kids and teenagers, looks at integrating mandatory personal finance courses. I think that's something that I can speak to the U.S. is not mandated across the nation, and I think it's really important because the lack of understanding sort of basic finance issues results in so many challenges for people in their households as they move through their life. So that's something I do just personally encourage, and I also encourage mandatory communications classes. And again, they exist. Like I said, I knew they existed. I just didn't take them, and that's part of the reason I didn't take them is because it wasn't required. And I think I thought to myself, well, I'm never, as a young kid, as a 14-year-old, I thought, well, I'm not a communications person. I like to read, right? I don't need to learn about communications without bothering to understand or having the experience of life to think anything that you do, you're going to have to communicate with people. And the ability to communicate effectively is going to be something that's going to be an asset for anyone, no matter what their life experience is. And so those are my two, personal requests for global consideration for young people: personal finance, sort of the basics, and communications. So in this series, specifically in the show today, it's amazing. The show topics are a combination of things that you, the community members, share with me, ask me about. that things that people mention to me when I give a speech or a presentation, or I'm out somewhere doing a live event, and also things that I read about or something that may relate to something that I was teaching in one of my graduate courses for my students. So it's a variety of different opportunity for me to pull show topics from, but sometimes we'll do a show and it hits close to home. It's a show where I think, oh, I definitely could have suggested this myself. And today, this is one of those shows. So today, here in episode 211, in our Communications Communicate series, our specific show topic is your speaking speed sabotaging your career? 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 So, okay, obviously we're asking, is your speaking speed sabotaging your career? Say that a few times fast. I love alliteration, but we create these things and then I go through and I vet these lists and I look at these and I think, I love alliteration. I love creative use of language. And then I have to say it a few times and I didn't realize in the creation process how slippery it is to use speaking speed sabotaging. Say that a few times fast. And when I just repeated the show topic, on the third time I said it really fast, and the fourth time I said it really slow. And that was to begin to illustrate how important this is. So one of the things, again, that we often don't have the opportunity to observe is how we communicate with the rest of the world. And part of the huge obstacle, of course, is we are inside of our own bodies. So everything that we are witnessing and that we're observing about our communication is either distorted or is restricted in terms of viewing and understanding the totality of what we're communicating. So part of this, when I say distorted, one of the things that we've mentioned in this series, Communications Communicate, is the beauty of and really honestly just the wonder of our voices. And some shows, we mention and talk about, and I do encourage you to investigate and learn more about, if it's not an area of your expertise, just the physical requirements to be able to use speech the way that we do as humans. And you combine that with, of course, the neurological requirements to combine the thoughts and the speech practice and pattern. It's amazing. It really is. And when you hear your own voice played back, so I used to say, if you ever listen to your voice on an answering machine, but now, if you listen to your voice on just a voice recording, so if you had a computer or tablet or smartphone and you recorded your voice and you played it back from the device and you listened to that, it sounds distorted. I have unfortunately had a little bit atypical exposure in terms of the amount of exposure I've had to hearing my own voice played back. Often because when you're performing or doing a television recording or this program, the podcast and the shows we do, there are unfortunately times when I'm compelled to listen to my voice played back on a recording. And it's awful. It sounds weird. It doesn't sound the same way it sounds when I speak. Now, I've been listening to myself speak since I began speaking, which as a toddler, and I'm vocalizing as an infant. I don't recall exactly my first vocalizations, but to the best of my understanding, I was a pretty, standard human trajectory, child development. So I'm sure I've been listening to my own voice, to my own vocal sounds, even before they were words, basically my existence. And yet when I hear my voice played back, it doesn't sound right. It sounds weird and distorted. It sounds like somebody's playing a trick on me. And that's partially because we're inside of our own body, just the acoustics of it all, right? So you're in your physical body and you hear your voice coming out differently than the whole rest of the, you know, universe hears it, because they're not inside our bodies with us and we're hearing things differently. So that's what I say, distorted. And the other thing, of course, is I said restricted. We have an restricted understanding. So even when you look in a mirror or you hear your voice back on the recording is still not exactly what people hear out in three-dimensional world, right? It's still an approximation of it. And so we're getting, again, this restricted understanding. When you add in your totality, right, of how everything works at once. So your voice, your facial expressions, your eye contact, your posture, and the 360-degree analysis that someone has when they're interacting with you in real life, we're not getting any of that in terms of understanding all of it. I mean, you would have to have, I'm sure, really expensive and advanced technology to be able to get, a real-time 360-degree full rendering of exactly what you're communicating to people in real life. But we get little restricted glimpses of it, even though they're also distorted. The speed issue, which is the topic of the show today, is one that, as I said, the topic hits close to home for me personally. Yet it's also one of these issues that when we look at the show, I am constantly, just in my regular day-to-day life, observing people who have not paid attention to the speed of their speech. And we tend to have two main areas that we want to look at. One, we're too fast, and the other, we're too slow. And when you're just out and about in your regular life like I am, and you're interacting and you're listening to other people, you're going to hear people who are doing both of these. So sometimes people are too fast, and sometimes people are too slow. And then sometimes, like Goldilocks, they're just right. The challenge, of course, is that all of these things are relative, and they're impacted by a lot of things. What the actual language you're using is one thing. The culture that you're in. So different cultures and subcultures have different expectations for speed, dialect, and also the actual language you're using. There's a lot going on. One of the things that I would strongly suggest that I would get feedback about as a young person that I mostly discounted is that you pay attention to what other people tell you. So, for example, when I was a young person, so young child or teenager, I would have situations where people would say to me, "Hey, can you slow down? You speak really fast." People would say that. I remember that. I would ignore them and discount what they said and think, well, that's silly. They should listen faster. What's wrong with them? And part of the reason I discounted what they said is because I speak very similarly to the people in my family of origin, which is rather common for us. You learn and you mimic, especially initially. And there's fantastic research and data on how infants acquire language, right? Everything from the vocabulary and the dialect and everything. So we tend to some degree, often mimic or reflect in some ways who we heard growing up. Like, who were we around? And so I speak at my relaxed, sort of natural pace, similarly to my sibling spoke to my parents or cousins or aunts and uncles. And if you ever had come to a family get-together, you would hear pretty much a consistent rate of speed that people shared. So within that environment, I sound normal. Yet, like I said, when I would get feedback from people at school, other kids, or sometimes maybe even a teacher, or staff member or an adult, and I would just discount it thinking, well, that's silly. I sound like everybody else sounds. I speak like the people who I live with, right? I speak, and oddly, I would also find, like many of us do, we find, and there's also really interesting research on this, that we tend to we tend to feel comfortable around people who are like us. So we tend to quote like people who are quote like us. And we do that in a lot of ways. So people have a similar sense of humor, we like. People have a similar vocabulary, we like. People have similar life experience, we like. People who speak similarly, we like. So on top of my problem where I was already in a micro environment where I learned language and acquired language, uh, I tended to also be exposed to other people who were similar to myself in speed and thought this is normal. And when someone would say something about the speed, saying it was too fast, I again would literally think in my mind, what are they, what are they saying? They need to listen more intently because I'm speaking at a normal rate of speed. And I ignored this probably all the way up until the awful, which I've shared in, I'm sure, every series every show in this series, the awful, horrible, embarrassing time when I was in my graduate program and my doctorate of jurisprudence program in law school, and I was forced to witness myself on video for the first time for an extended amount of time, and understood that all of the prior years of people trying to help me that I had ignored was to my own detriment. So all that's to say, our speed of speech, where do we learn it? Like most of the sort of fundamental parts of speech, we learn it from wherever we were acquiring speech, whoever was around us. And again, there's also really interesting data on before we were even a viable, independent human, we were in utero, that we are impacted to some extent by the voices, right, of the person whose body we were inside, and potentially other sounds, right? So we're picking this up from very early developmental times. So that's where we get it. And then, as I said, we compound problems because we tend to also self-segregate ourselves in communities and in social settings with people who sound like we do because it's comfortable, which makes the challenge even worse because we're just reinforcing the same issues. And then when we get feedback, I shared my own sad experience. When people were trying to help me, I just ignored them. And I thought, well, that's stupid. I mean, what's their problem? Okay. Part of the challenge about speed is that it is, again, relative to so many issues. So, for example, my family, when I was growing up, moved around the world. So my father was in the United States Army, and because of that, we moved a lot. We moved about every 18 months to 24 months, and we just moved to different parts of the world, which is awesome and great. And it also exposed me to different speech speed issues. So, for example, in the United States and the southern, especially in the south and the southeast parts of the United States, sometimes what's called the deep south, people tend to speak at a slower cadence than they do in other parts of the United States. For example, the east, northeast part, or even the west coast, to be fair. In the south, people tend to speak slower, and they also have different slang and different dialects that they use. And there are different types of geographic differences in speed that you can hear, whether it's the South. In New England, the most northern, eastern New England part of the United States, Maine, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, especially. I worked in Rhode Island one time. This is a few years ago. I was giving a speech. So I'm out and I'm traveling around giving a speech, and I was in Rhode Island, which I've been many, many times. And I don't remember exactly where my speech was, but I'm pretty sure I flew into Providence, right? So I'm in Rhode Island, which is a wonderful state. And so there's a regional accent that is very discernible and strong especially if you're not from an area, like you didn't grow up there. It's easier for you to hear it. So like I said, I grew up around people who speak fast, relatively speaking. So to me, I couldn't hear it because I'm used to it. It's the same thing with accents. Had I grown up around people who use certain types of accents, I would be used to that. So to me, I wouldn't really hear it. So I flew into Rhode Island. This is a very quick anecdote, and it's a speed issue, but it's also it's a dialect. It's an accent too. And I was at a hotel front desk trying to get directions, and I will never forget this. I literally So this is in the United States, in the state of Rhode Island, if you've been there. And it's been there because the United States geographically, just on a map, is pretty large, and it has an interesting history, which parts of the country were settled at different times, and that's history. There's a dialect there that the person at the front desk of the hotel in Rhode Island in the U.S., I honestly could not understand what they were saying. I'm not kidding. Like I asked them, could you please repeat it? And I still couldn't even understand the words. And it's not that they were doing anything weird. It's because I hadn't been there enough, or I hadn't been there enough and paid attention to be able to pick up quickly. And it was one of those moments in life where I stood there and I honestly felt like I was going to cry, because I just thought I honestly don't understand what they're saying, and I needed the information. So it all worked out. And over a little bit, by just listening, I understood what people were saying. It wasn't them, it was me. And part of this, when you look at speed, is you're going to have to be aware of where you are. So I worked in Fargo, which is a great city, and there's an accent in that part of the Dakotas that I made not a great, wasn't supposed to be a joke, but there was a movie a few years ago, mass market movie, actually very good film, my personal opinion, award-winning. Anyway, called Fargo, and it had people who played characters that were from that region that had those similar types of accents, or they pretended to in the film. And I made a point about mentioning something about the great film, and people in the meeting in Fargo said something like, what accent? And what they meant was they can't hear it, and they're telling the truth. Just like I can't hear speed when I'm from that environment, it sounds to me normal. And it is normal for that environment. But we all have to interact with people, potentially, as we move through life, that come from different environments. And so much of the communication isn't that we change anything about us, but we want to be aware when we're speaking for purpose. So when I'm speaking for purpose, for example, at work, I'm trying to get something done. I need people to understand information. I need to convey information. I need to learn information. I'm trying to maybe persuade someone to do something or not do something. I'm trying to educate someone. I'm trying to get their attention. I'm speaking for purpose. When I'm speaking, hanging out with, family or friends, I'm not necessarily, I'm still speaking for a purpose. I'm trying to tell a story or entertain someone or whatever, but it's less formal. And again, I'm often, and you too are often, we're going to fall back into these habitual speech patterns because we're going to be around people in our social lives, in our personal lives that we choose to be around. So it's less work. When I'm speaking for purpose in my profession, it's more exciting and interesting because I get to customize my delivery to maximize my positive outcome. So where do we get the speed from? Typically, we learned it. And it was reinforced by the people that you were around. It's also reinforced by the geographic location where you are, because you pick up really strong cultural expectations based on where you are. The challenge when you're working and you're speaking for purpose, and we talk about in this show, is your speaking speed sabotaging your career, is that we cannot go out into the world and expect that everyone in the world is going to bend to our will and do exactly what we want. Our speaking speed is part of that larger concept of going out into the world and feeling entitled and having the expectation that everybody else is just going to have to adjust to how we do things. That is an inaccurate perception, and it is a very negative orientation to the world, because there are over 7 billion people on this planet. They are all not going to do exactly what we want, the way we want, how we want, based on what we are used to. That is unrealistic. When we are speaking for purpose, then we have to plan and think about, what's the goal? Why are we doing this? What do we want? Right? Surpassing our goals. And we have to start to take responsibility for the things in our communications arsenal of tools that may be uncomfortable. Part of the reason I said communications, I requested to the global and beyond, so in other parts of other planets, wherever our species goes, that we look at young people and focusing on communications earlier and in some sort of a standardized mandatory method, is because it's very, for many of us, the older we are, the longer we've been alive and using the same behavior, we view our speed, we view our tone, our pitch, our accent, we view a lot of this as sort of who we are. And some people it becomes emotionally and psychologically very, very difficult to begin to even examine how other people view us, because we trigger a lot of people's very deep-seated issues. People may feel, well, I'm being judged. Someone may not think I'm as intelligent as they are due to the speed of my speech. Someone may think something negative about me due to my dialect or an accent that I may utilize. And because our communication behaviors are so caught up and tied in a lot of our ways, for a lot of us, to our identity of who am I? Who are we? That when you do something which seems rational, sort of, on paper, in the abstract, okay, let me look at my speed and see if that's the most effective speed for me to use to communicate to people at work, right? Or in a professional setting. That seems like that's not a non-judgmental issue. Yet when you start to do it in practice, it is very emotional for people. I was approached, I gave a keynote speech, and it was in the US, and I was approached afterwards by somebody who asked me if I had a practice where I would work with people who wanted to go into public speaking, whether it was politics or some sort of job that would require more public speaking. And at the time, I said, well, no, I actually haven't. But it's an interesting idea. I have had requests, and I am moving forward to provide some specific, very limited coaching and career strategy work one-on-one with people and in small groups on just communication issues, because I see how important this is. And like I said, when we look at something, it sounds totally non-judgmental. Just listen to the voice playback and watch the video, and then we'll just work on maximizing your ability to effectually communicate with other people, with your voice, with your posture, with your tone, with your pitch, with all the things that we discuss, with your vocabulary. It seems, again, non-judgmental and just like any rational decision we would make that would potentially help us be able to communicate with more people. That's not difficult. Yet, because so many of these things become wound up in our identity, people get very emotional, and it prevents them from being able to look at this dispassionately and make minor modifications and enhancements that do not repudiate who you are, or where you're from, or any of this at all. So for me personally, my challenge is fast speaking. My speed that sabotaged my career. And fortunately, I was in a situation where I was humiliated. It wasn't intended to be, but I was in a course, I was in a program where speaking is a huge part of the job in my law school curriculum, and I was in that program, and that's where I was first forced to observe and listen to my speaking, and then also watch videos with all these other things that I was doing, using verbal crutches and all kinds of things. Verbal crutches are words that I use as a placeholder or as a habit that distract from what I'm saying. Things like, you know what I mean? Like, okay. All right, we did a show on verbal crutches. If you haven't, please access that show. The speed situation for me is fast speed. And what tends to happen is this: the more excited I am, and this may be shocking for some of you, but I get really excited sometimes. I get really excited and really passionate. And the more excited, the more passionate I am, potentially it's the physical part of it. Maybe it's a little adrenaline that kicks in. My speed speeds up. So for example, if I'm really excited and I want to say something and I'm really thinking about something that's really meaningful to me and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is so great, I can't wait to tell people, okay, I can go really fast. That was just a little example, and it wasn't even in my mind really that fast. The challenge, of course, is when I'm speaking professionally for purpose. I'm getting really excited, right? I'm motivated. I'm fired up. How do I then address the speed issue? when you come to the show page, CourtneyAnderson.com, as you know, this episode we've mentioned is 211. That means hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I believe over 600 pages of content on CourtneyAnderson.com. This show has a specific microsite just for this site. It's CourtneyAnderson.com / the rest of the URL will bring you to this program. And again, for me, it's fast speed. And the more excited I am, the faster I go. Or being excited could also mean being nervous or having anxiety, right? Other people have the other side of this spectrum. They speak so slowly. All right. Let's look. We said a lot of foundation in this episode that I'm trying to disassociate us, you and I individually, from any kind of emotional or psychological or mental focus thinking that our speed reflects anything about us. It doesn't. All our speed is a reflection of where we learn the language, literally the people we were around, and then often it also gives you indicators into what geographic part of the world. That's all it is. So it's not. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't say anything about how intelligent we are or aren't. It doesn't say anything about whether we're good people or bad people. It doesn't say anything about any of that. All it says is where we learn this, the individuals we were around, and then the geographic region. That's it. That's all it says. And that's really important because we have to disassociate ourselves from the speed issue of our communication to any type of feeling that this is making a judgment on who we are. It isn't. It's just a pattern. The other thing is when you're speaking a language and you're listening to a language, it does have an impact when you learned it. So if it's your first language or your only language, you're typically going to have more exposure to it. So you're going to have different expectations for speed. If you are using a language that is not your first language or your primary language, it's a second or third. I've met people who speak 11, 12 languages. It's awesome. So when you learn languages later on and you use them less frequently, then of course, when you go to utilize that language, we often are moving at a slower speed. And native speakers of that language sound like they're going incredibly fast. They're not. It's just that they're using it all the time. And the more that you use a language, the more that you potentially get to the point where you're thinking in that language. And when you start thinking in the language, then of course you're able to speak faster. What you do when you're using a language that's not your primary language or not your first language, then what you'll often do by habit is you'll go to your primary language and you'll start thinking in that language. And then you translate it into the second language. And that slows you down just by virtue of that process. So those are other things that you want to be aware of. So is your speed sabotaging your career? The answer is, if you think it is, I'm telling you it is. If you think it isn't, if you look at this show topic and think my speaking speed is perfect, I'm at a pace that is sheer perfection. When I speak, the speed is one that there could be no improvement. Okay. Is that possible? Yes. Is it probable? No. I struggle with this, and I speak relatively to most people a lot. Meaning that my work, when I do a full day of training or speaking, I speak for 6 hours. That's atypical. And I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of television live shows and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and probably at this point, honestly, tipping to thousands of speaking events around the world. So I speak atypically a little bit more than most people do, especially in a presentation format or in a performing event type thing. And I still struggle with this. So we all struggle. We all can get better. This is an ongoing process of monitoring and looking to see where your habits are. My habits are personally speeding up. The more nervous I am and the more excited I am, the faster I'm going to go. Oddly enough, the more relaxed I am, the faster I'm going to go. So I'm sort of doomed, right? So if I'm nervous and excited, if I'm nervous, I speed up. If I'm relaxed, I speed up, right? You have to tackle this seriously. What we've been talking about are some of the steps. One, make peace with where you learned the language speed. It's not you. Even if you taught yourself most of what you do, you still had to be exposed to other sounds. So take some of this off your shoulders. It's not a reflection on you and I. It just tells us where we learned this, what other people and what other parts of the world where we pick these things up. Okay? Secondly, what is your habit? Is your habit to go faster or go slower? One easy indicator is, what have people told you? Like myself, you may have experienced a situation where people did give you feedback and you ignored it, like I did. Do not do that. For people who sometimes speak slower, when I talk and I work with them and I ask them, what is this? They say, well, I'm gathering my thoughts. And I say, well, cool, I get that. We all do that. The challenge is, though, you need to gather them before you start speaking. So literally, you could say to somebody, hey, that's interesting. That's a good point. Give me a minute on that. And then literally take the minute. But don't start dripping out the words like a faucet, right? That has a leak. And there's just this slow drip. Sometimes just waiting for that one drop to fall. And then waiting for the next drop. Okay. It's distracting. Speed, and again, this is going to be culturally dependent. What is the expectation where you are for speed? Now, if you're not moving to that place, you're not going to be permanently living there and having to use that cultural reference all the time. If you're like me, I gave my little story when I went to Rhode Island, and because I wasn't, in all fairness, I'm sure I was also really tired and jet lagged, wasn't paying attention, I really found myself in a situation where I couldn't understand someone, and I needed that information. They were doing what they were supposed to. I wasn't as attuned as I needed to be. But it shows how serious these things are, even when it's in the same a language that you know and use. So what you may look at, in every language, there's going to be a sort of generic version of it, a generic version, and you'll often see those utilized in people who are in communication fields. Newscasters or presenters often will speak in the most sort of bland version of a language without using a lot of dialect specific or slang specific variations. Because why? Because they are hired to be on a broadcast potentially, or to communicate that the people who pay them don't want someone to turn that show off and say, well, I don't understand that dialect. They don't want that. No, they want people to be able to turn in and enjoy it. So a lot of times in performances, you'll hear sort of a more, again, generic, and in many ways some would argue boring version of a language, because it's trying to strip away a lot of the dialects or slang or speech patterns or speeds that would make it difficult for someone who wasn't from that part of that place. That's a great way, though, to also learn and expose yourself to those speeds. I'll never forget, I had a Spanish tutor couple of years ago, great tutor, that I was working with, because at that time, and I still am working on this, I had been very fluent in my Spanish, and I hadn't been using it for a while, and so I was trying to regain some fluency, and so she recommended, you need to sit down and watch the news in Spanish. That luckily I lived in a part of the world where they had channels that were in Spanish that I could do that, and it was great, and she was right. The other thing, of course, you need to use the language. You need to be around it more, as much as you possibly can, so you get to the point, hopefully, you can start thinking in it at least partially. That'll speed it up. But what I'm saying is, and again, this is not a judgment. It's not a judgment that any dialect or any language or any speed is a pronouncement on you as a person. All it is a reflection on how people in that region have developed speech patterns. Now, all of this is actually, like I said, fascinating to study. And it is really interesting. But in this program and what we're working on in our show is how do you use speech? Is it sabotaging your career? Are people saying, I don't want her to give the presentation, or I don't want to hire him to lead the meeting? I don't want them to go on the client call because they're so slow or they're so fast, they're gonna lose the deal. Or I'm not going to hire that person to be the presenter. I'm not going to hire them as a teacher. I don't want them as a salesperson. I mean, there's really almost nothing I can think of where communication doesn't matter. There's some jobs where it's going to matter more in terms of a priority of the job skills, and some where it'll matter less, but it still always will matter. We do not need to give up opportunities because we refuse, because it may be painful or embarrassing to examine our speech patterns. I'm embarrassing myself in this series. And I am pretty confident until I stop speaking and no longer in this body as I know it, will continue to have to be vigilant with the speed. I go too fast. If you're in that situation or you're in the situation where it's too slow, you need to recognize it. It's not an indictment of us. It just is a reality. That's what we learned. When we are speaking for purpose, for our career, we want to remember it's as effectively as possible to reach as many people as possible, which is why I mentioned people in media often or in entertainment will use dialects and will speak in a way that will allow them to have the greatest reach for potential viewers or people who enjoy their entertainment. That's why they're doing that. Nothing's wrong, quote unquote, with certain speeds or certain dialects or accents or anything else. It's just that I can reach more people if they can understand me. So what are the steps that we are going to take? If you haven't done so, you're going to record. Ideally, also have somebody else record you. And then you're going to force yourself to listen to at least 5 minutes nonstop of you speaking. I don't want you doing anything to distract yourself while that's happening. So I don't want you to have it in the background while you're doing something else. I don't want you to giggle and laugh. Oh, I can't believe I sound like this. Just be quiet and listen to it. Because it's easier for you to hear it when it's played back than when it's coming out of our own heads. Remember, what we hear and what we think our voice sounds like isn't what it sounds like, because we're in this body, in this physical being. So it's distorted. And when you listen to it played back, it will be instructive. Now, once you begin to get an understanding of might it be too slow or might it be too fast, how do you slow it down? How do you speed it up? You have to pace it intentionally. So for myself, when I'm speaking for purpose, I intentionally focus on my thoughts. And more importantly than that, I force myself to use my breathing. And I force myself to sound like to myself that I'm moving in slow motion. If you ever have had experience to a record player, so this is an LP, a record player, they would have the speed on the record players that would be faster and slower. 45, 33, 78. This is for those of you who are either aficionados or just older enough to remember. If you ever played a record in slow motion, it sounded like it was in slow motion. Sometimes when I speak, that's what it sounds like to me inside my head. That I am going so slow. But I'm putting bumpers, speed bumps, to intentionally do that. When I'm speaking in parts of the world, which for me is a lot of the world, that's not my native place. And because I said I don't have a native place. So in a way, I guess this is good for me. It's easier for me. Everywhere I go, I basically am not from there. So I use my speech and I slow it down even more depending on how many communication barriers there may be. So if I'm in the United States, then an American accent, sort of a generic American accent, is something people are more used to because they hear it all the time. When I go to certain parts of the United States, I just, I shared whether I'm in Alabama or I'm in Rhode Island or I'm in Fargo or I'm in Idaho or I'm in Los Angeles or South Florida. So there will be different dialects in all these places. So when I speak, I don't sound like I'm from there because I'm not. That is a hindrance. If I was going to move someplace and just stay there my whole rest of my life, I probably would start trying to pick up some of the dialect just to fit in a little bit more and make it easier for people to understand me. But I do know that in the States that my American accent is something that even though people aren't used to the exact dialect I use and the exact speed I use, they are going to be generically familiar with the generic American accent. So that makes it a little easier. If I'm in Canada, then even though it's not necessarily an American accent, they're used to a North American accent. So it's a little bit easier. If I'm in a part of the world where English is a primary language or a language that is often used, that helps me. Obviously, if I'm in a part of the world where people are used to hearing British accent English or dialect or Australian English, then I'm going to have a few more barriers. If I'm in a part of the world where English is not the primary language, then I know that I have a few more barriers. And every time there's a barrier, I just slow it down even more. If you're on the other side of the spectrum and you're too slow, every time there's a barrier, speed it up. You're trying to get to a point where people can listen and follow along. If you're too slow, I'm not following you because in all of the space you leave, I've already drifted off. I literally may have fallen asleep. More likely, I'm just distracted. I'm on my smartphone. I'm daydreaming about what I'm going to eat for dinner. I'm remembering a movie I saw. I'm wondering, what's going to happen later on with my stomach, if it's going to hurt. I mean, I'm doing all kind of stuff, and I am no longer focused on what you're saying. So you have lost me. And that is not effective for your work when you have a purpose in your career. That's why you're going to speed up so that I'm with you. I'm listening. Getting someone's attention and holding it is why communication is so difficult. This is a skill. In many instances, it's an art. And you have to use everything at your disposal. Your speed, your pitch, your tone, projection, your vocabulary, then your body language, your eye contact, your facial expression, your posture. You got to pull out everything you have because you're trying to get people's attention and hold it as long as you can to be able to persuade them to either do something or to hear what you're saying, to whatever your outcome is. And this is a very, very, very difficult skill. And I mean very difficult. So when you're in some place and it's the place where you learned your dialect and your speed, and that's where your audience, and that's going to be the easiest place. Just like my analogy at the beginning, where I said if I'm around a relative or someone that was raised the way I am, speaking the speed, then we all relax and speak the same speed because we all come from that same place where that's what we expect and we're used to it. The further I move away outside that little tiny part of the universe where the people learned exactly the language skills that I learned, means I have to then be much more conscious and aware. Part of what you're going to work on for your speed is going to be the skill. To be able to understand, is it too fast, is it too slow? And then to be able to then implement either speed bumps. I use speed bumps to slow me down. You're going to need to use your enunciation. You're going to need to enunciate your words because remember, the further we move away from people who are just like us, which is going to be literally the people you are either from your quote hometown and in your family, which is very few people on this planet, you must enunciate because they're trying to follow your speed and also be able to understand exactly what words you're using. And it's harder because remember, they're going to use different accents and different dialects, and you're going to have to try your best to meet their needs. When we communicate and we're the speaker, the onus is on us to make it as easy as possible for that listener to be able to receive our content. On the show page on CourtneyAnderson.com for this show, I've got a quote, and it's from Inc., periodical magazine for business, right, for Incorporated, and they have a quote there. It's from an article about speaking too fast, and the quote says, "Speaking too fast makes your listeners work too hard, and that's the last thing you want to do." Yes, exactly. You don't want your listener to work too hard. When you have my part of this challenge, the too fast part, they can't follow and they tune out. If you have the other side of this spectrum and you're too slow, they're not following and they've tuned out. In either event, we are failing to communicate effectively, and that is why we are sabotaging our career. No one knows what we said. It could have been a brilliant idea. Nobody knows because they either tuned out or refocused on something else. And whatever it is we were trying to convey is lost. That is our responsibility. We cannot make an argument, again, that the whole world, 7 billion plus people, have to yield and do exactly what we want. They should listen the way we want. No. They've learned what they've learned in terms of language. We are the ones now trying, and will accomplish these professional goals, but we have to take responsibility for this. And then once you have the skills, understanding you need to speed up or you need to slow down, so speed bumpers, or you need to go ahead and give some speed accelerators, then you must focus on, is there some other emotional or psychological or mental reason that is being an impediment to your success? And often, for many of us, there is. The whole concept of a fear of public speaking, that's not a situation about, that's not speed or anything like that. That is simply, I don't want all the other people looking at me. What if I say something stupid? What if I mess up? All of those fears. That's the other aspect of it. That's not your mouth making the sounds. That's mentally, emotionally, psychologically. It needs to be addressed from that perspective. So you can feel confident enough. Yes, I should be in this meeting. I should be on this phone call. I should be in the sales. I should be making this presentation at the government committee. You need to have that foundational confidence. If you do not believe that you should be listened to, you will not be listened to. And a lot of the things that people do that sabotage their career, I'm going so fast that nobody can really understand me because I'm really scared. I don't want anyone to hear what I'm saying because I could be really stupid. I may go so fast because I really don't want anybody to listen. I may speak slowly because I don't want anybody to listen. In other programs, we talk about the verbal crutch. Again, I don't want anybody really to hear me. I'm nervous. I don't believe in myself. I could have a pitch problem. I could have a tone, a projection problem. All of these are things where I'm intentionally sabotaging myself because I really don't think I should be the one that has the voice, that has this opportunity and this platform to speak. So this is a two-pronged approach. There's a physical part of this. The physical part is literally, what's the speed? Just like if you were driving an automobile and you were clocked by the law enforcement. They said you're speeding. Okay, yeah, how fast were you going? It's the same thing. That's part of this, is a physical, measurable. You gotta listen to it. I said at least 5 minutes, and you need to do that for multiple settings. At least 5 settings, at 5 different times, 5 different occasions. You need to listen. And just force yourself to do it. Yes, it's embarrassing. I hate listening to myself because it sounds weird. My voice is weird. The whole thing, right? But we must force ourselves to do this to be able to understand. Just like some of us love getting on a scale to check or verify our weight. Some of us hate it. Even if you hate getting on the scale, you have to do it so that you know what you weigh, so you can make sure you're making good, healthy choices. Just check it. Some people say, well, I haven't been on the scale, and they get on there and they're shocked. Oh my goodness, I had no idea that number. What, right? And sometimes people don't get on the scale because they don't want to be held accountable for it. So part of it is how fast are you going? How slow are you going? Measurement, right? The second part is what's really going on inside of your assessment of yourself where you feel you don't deserve to be heard. Because that's the core thing that's driving a lot of the sabotage behaviors. As I said at the outset, this is not something that I've been to university and studied for multiple years in a degree, formal degree program. This is something that I constantly am reading and learning and doing all that I can to continue to on the job, learn more about this field. Yes, I am a work in progress. I am fully aware of that. But so many of the things that bring me great joy in my career, I will not be able to do at all if I do not make this a priority. I am strongly encouraging you to do so and ask yourself, why don't you believe that you deserve a voice? And I'm telling you that I believe you do because you're here. And when you get to the place where mentally and emotionally and psychologically you're prepared and you feel like, yes, I do have something to say that's of value equally with anybody else's, then you clear out a lot of the things that are obstacles. And then the only thing you have left to really focus on is looking at your actual skill. So for me, what I focus on is using my speed bumps, breathing, sounding like in my own head, I'm in slow motion. Depending on where I'm speaking in the world and who I'm speaking to, I will use even the slower methods. But I'll compensate when there are more language barriers. I will speak slower and use more common vocabulary words. But I will also usually increase my body language so that I'm acting out physically with my arms and my legs and my torso and my body and my facial expression a lot of what the message I'm trying to convey is, depending on what type of live event I'm doing, what the purpose is, if it's more entertainment or what type of information I'm trying to convey. So this is a lifetime commitment to you focusing on and continuing to enhance your communications. We have a lot of work to do. But these are the two main areas: assessment of the actual skill, speed itself, and the other thing is what's causing that. Are you scared? Do you think that what you have to say is not important? Do you think that nobody will listen to you? Do you think that you're not good enough? What else is going on? And when you address these things, you understand you're two different parts of the challenge. But as you address the part where you do get to a very comfortable place and realize I have a voice as equal to anyone else's, I believe what I have to say is worthwhile, I have complete self-respect, that eliminates a lot of the things that hurt people in this area. Now that allows us to focus on what do I need to do in either preparing my material, which is another part of this, how you either write out or prepare actually what you will be saying. In addition to the actual delivery, your pacing, whether you use breathing, whether you use mental breaks, however it is that you're starting to use your physical and your mental process along with your preparation of your content to get to a speed that is reflective of, again, that sort of average, generic newscaster version. That's what you're aiming for. That's the speed that you're aiming for. So if you listen to all of this and you thought, okay, maybe I'm too slow, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do you need to go look on the local or national media news presenter or news reader? Those people are paid to keep people listening, ideally because they're effective at communicating. They're going to use an accent that is very neutral, and they're going to use a speed which ideally will reach the largest amount of people. So that is an excellent way for you to benchmark your goal. So those are the action items. You're going to get a measurement. You're going to expose yourself to at least 5 minutes on at least 3 to 5 different occasions to begin to get a speed. You're going to listen to what other people say. You're going to understand this is totally not at all reflective of you as a person or your intellectual ability or anything else. It's just what you learned. It's no big deal. What you're going to do also then is start to address, are there any issues that you're doing emotionally or psychologically that are causing a lot of this, where you don't want to effectively improve your communication skills, where you think you don't have anything to say, or you don't like your ideas, or you think you're not smart enough, or any of that kind of silliness. You're going to address that individually with people who care about you and maybe with professional help, right? To get that under control to a point where it's not destructive and it's also not realistic. Of course you have something important to say. You're you. Why not you? Then we're going to integrate that very strong foundation of, I feel good about myself and I feel like what I have to say, yes, is just as worthwhile as anyone else's. Okay? And then I'm going to start to look at, what do I need to do in my preparation period, my practice period, and my delivery period to either speed myself up or slow myself down. And again, the great easy benchmark, if I'm not really sure what I'm doing, where I'm aiming for speed, look at and listen to your local or national or regional media broadcasters, because they're hired for exactly this reason, because they're really effective. So listen to them on radio, or watch them on their television or video or internet, whatever. They're paid for this for a reason, because they're effective at it. And that can be a good generic starting point for you. I loved this show. These, again, are very tough topics. It's tough to face our own communication issues, yet it is imperative for our career for us to be able to effectively reach as many people as possible. And it's fun. We can only get better. We're putting work into it. We're not going to get, quote, worse. And this is, like I said, this is a really fun, dynamic, exciting, and interesting part of our career. And I am thrilled that you joined me. Please reach out to me. Let me know if you have any show suggestions or ideas. Again, I'm on Twitter at Zealous Business. CourtneyAnderson.com, of course, is our main site. I do ask that you to stop by. And I, again, thank you for being here in the program. And make sure now that you get to that comfortable speed with your speech that will enhance your career.